Any questions or confusions, concerns? It's like the morning class. Everyone's going to be quiet today, I suspect. Well, good luck on that. I was trying to think of something sort of theme-based to go over. I didn't have time to actually work up a PowerPoint. To be honest, I'm tired of PowerPoints. So this is going to be a set of images and then just sort of talking story that ties in this whole idea of place, but more importantly, sort of this whole sort of theme of perception and reality I was talking about before. It's actually, I got this idea last night. I was watching on the news, and they were saying there's some sort of a Burning Man celebration they'd done in San Francisco, which got hammered by the authorities because they had over 1,000 people in a small parking lot, which strikes me as sort of somewhere beyond incredibly stupid, but whatever's. But it got me to thinking about this. And this is actually, what I'm going to be talking about today is actually in part of what my dissertation research on was, which had to do perception of place and how perceptions of places shape the decisions we make about them. So we're going to be sort of moving through history, but also sort of a contemporary session. I think I've got a good little video in here, so let's see how this plays out. But again, if there's anything that gets confusing or something, be sure and stop and ask, because I've literally got this on a small piece of paper. So when you're looking at the settlement of North America, and by this I mean largely your European settlers selling what's now the United States, they see this whole continent as being basically empty, and therefore it's available for them as they choose to use. You get a lot of this imagery around Thanksgiving with the idea of the Pilgrims in Massachusetts. So the key here is your majority population is migratory. They're coming from somewhere else, and they're not only coming here for political reasons, but they're also coming here for a very strong set of sort of value attitude reasons, which has to do with the idea that if there's empty space and it doesn't belong to anyone, then one of the things you can do is if you move over to that place, you can then stake a claim on that empty space and make it yours. So it's not by accident that American history in the last 300 something years has been in most cases the movement of folks who didn't have stuff somewhere else to the United States with the idea that they could get something out of it. I can't remember what the plaque is on the Statue of Liberty, but it's all part of that sort of ethos. And it's not by accident that was during this period. So you can sort of see that here, this image that we've got. This is one of the classic images. I have no idea. I never can remember where this originally was painted and what it was for or anything. But this is so classically sort of this whole logic. Very quickly on, what you get is the settlement, which initially was just sort of opportunistic. You're British or you're Irish or something, just like getting the hell out of town because something's gone bad back home. So you're just moving to the new world to get something. But very quickly, what changes between Canada and the United States is that the Canadian settlement remains very different. Canadian settlement always involved a fairly large proportion of the middle class who are leaving, England or other areas for fairly complex economic reasons. The United States, on the other hand, tended to really sort of attract or almost tempt a population that was largely poor. So you could be someone or you could make yourself into something in the United States. That sort of becomes the mantra. Now, by the foundation of the American Republic, in other words, by 1783 in the United States is formed, you got the Bill of Rights and then the Constitution a little bit after. What very quickly becomes part of this is it moves from being sort of opportunistic moving into an empty spot into what's frequently in Islam would be called inshallah, or in Christian terms would be called God's will. So what happens is you move from migrating from one spot to another place as just being a decision that people make. And then you just, you live in Massachusetts and you move west or whatever. What happens is that now changes to the fact that the Americas, especially North America, has so few people and has so many resources and so much land, becomes intentionally designed by God to give you that. So this becomes the idea of the westward migration that you see in the 19th century, well, the 18th and 19th century. But also probably equally important is what we call manifest destiny. And feel free to Google this. There's a ton of stuff on this. Where basically by the early part of the American Republic, by the 1820s, 1830s, what you get is this constant discussion point in the United States that God has set up this part of the continent for the purpose of Europeans, i.e. white folks, to basically move across, populate it, and domesticate it. And this becomes this image of manifest destiny. And that's this particular image you see here. You've got, I can never remember if she's Liberty or what the hell she's supposed to be. I find it interesting that she's a Greek goddess, not an angel or something like this. It's very obviously tied to sort of Christianity in many ways. You've got the folks that are settling this. And notice how they're settling in an area that's empty. Running away from them, in other words, leaving this, are the bison up here and the Indians down here. So what you've got in this image is the idea that it's God's will that these folks move across this landscape, turn it into farms like you see over here, and out of that, turn this land from something that's empty and therefore not being used into something that's most profitable, successful, etc. This whole westward migration manifest destiny thing, there's a gazillion images of it. But it's important to remember that people actually believed it. Now times it's oftentimes seen in maybe a history class or something like that, as sort of an example, 19th century sort of whatever. But at the time, and in fact, I would argue in some cases still today, this is still a huge part of the American mindset. Now, one of the problems you get into is if you're moving from the East Coast, I assume back over this way, and you're moving to the West Coast over this way, is eventually you're going to run out of land. You're going to whack into the West Coast, and then you've filled up all this empty space. And this becomes a discussion by the 1880s, 1890s, when the Oklahoma Territory is opened up for settlement, when they take away the Indian Territory and basically throw the Indians out of it to all intents and purposes, and then open up the vast majority to Oklahoma. That's the last major land grab left in the continental United States. And so in that context, then by the later period, by the 1880s, people are saying, oh no, if God intended that we should have this sort of unlimited amount of land that we can expand and make money off of and, settle and stuff like that, what happened now that we settled all? What do you do now? What follows the migration, in other words, or what follows manifest destiny? And Americans never really come up with a particularly good idea of this or explanation for it. What they do decide, or what they do sort of come up with, is a very ambivalent view of what you might call this. So one of the other aspects of this is when you look at this side over here, is on one hand, you've got the plains or the open area. And here's the key part, you domesticate it. So you move across here, you actually change this from unused land to now farmland, used land, whether it be ranches, farms, whatever. And you've now domesticated it. And this is a very American concept of the world. And it's taken from the Europeans. A French formal garden would be a good example. The idea that you domesticate landscapes. And this again goes back to the whole Judeo-Christian concept of the relationship that people have with the world around them. That in the Judeo-Christian logic, especially the Old Testament, a man is put in a position of stewardship and superiority over the rest of the world by God, who's then superior to man. So think of Noah and the ark. So it's not that the animals build the ark and Noah goes along for the ride. Noah builds the ark to save the animals because God told him to do it. So this classic sort of parable is also a good example of this relationship that people are in a state of superiority over the rest of the planet. They have obligations, stewardship, but nonetheless they're superior to it. And so this means that if you're the folks that if you're the Europeans that settle in the United States, you get sort of a weird view of nature. Nature on one hand is something that you value. It was what God had made. God made North America in this theology, and then people moved and settled it. So God was responsible for forest and all the fish and all the stuff like that. On the other hand, there's this sort of attitude that if you don't do something with it, you're wasting it. So with that, let's drop this one. So I can keep trying all this stuff. Now, in that particular concept, then, what you get is a very strong sense that the land is subject to control. It's not enough that people have a landscape. There's a very strong attitude along with that people are responsible for managing it. In fact, if you look at the National Park Service, that's how they actually talk about things. The National Park Service's job is to manage the properties of the United States that are under federal control. And that also means control. In many cases, also means domesticate, just like that image with the farm on the right-hand side. Now, this becomes very, very complicated in the 19th and 20th century because these weird sort of ambivalent ideas of what nature is never disappear. In fact, they're still there, in some cases stronger. So for example, with the National Park Service or the National Forestry, there's these huge parts of the United States that are set aside theoretically to preserve for the people of the United States. That's the mandate of the National Forest. Now, one of those mandates or one of those jobs then, if Emily or someone else is actually a forest ranger, they're one of the administrators in charge of a national forest, is their job is to manage that. One of those managements is to basically provide a pristine environment for people to experience. And of course, that's what national parks are theoretically for. So if you go to a national park, you're allowed to sort of interact with nature outside of the world you're familiar with, and also in a modern context, especially the last 30 years, with the enormous amount of financial pressure, is for the National Forestry to pay for itself, as you actually then rent out property in the National Forest for people to live in, which didn't used to be the case as late as the 1970s, early 1980s, which if you notice about all the fires occurring right now in the western region of the United States, a lot of the folks that are getting their homes burned out in those fires are in national forest where they wouldn't have been in 1980. But because of changing policy of the idea of what the word management includes, and people with money were able to move into areas of national forest, so you could build your house in a forest, so you could experience nature perpetually versus just going and visiting in the back of an RV for a week. And so what you get is this becomes one half of this. Nature is a positive, nature is a good thing. And in that concept of nature, what you want to do is you want to enjoy it and experience, and you take the kids to the Fat National Forest in the summer bird vacation or whatever. Now, the other half of that is the idea of resource. But let's take a look at the video of the first one. Because if you think about it, this becomes one of the ambivalent aspects of this is, how do you actually do interaction with nature? Oops, hang on a second, I lost it. Okay. Oh, good, all right. Okay, now this is in Yellowstone. I was actually a ranger in Yellowstone for a month and a half and couldn't handle the job anymore, so I quit way back in the day as an undergrad. So I'm sort of familiar with this, but that was a long time ago. But as far as I know, the rules haven't changed very much. We're going to watch this short video, but before we get started, I want you to notice Yellowstone is one of the quintessential national parks. I have no idea what the numbers are, but I suspect it's probably between 20 and 30 million people a year go and visit this place. You can't live in Yellowstone. Okay, the rangers get to, but no one else does. So Yellowstone is set aside as a national preserve for people to go experience nature. Because of the huge populations, and this is looking at this particular image before we get going, what can you tell me that is part of management strategy or something that the National Park Service decided to do to manage this particular location in Yellowstone? What's not natural about this picture on the tourist? Something really obvious if you look at it.
The buffalo.
Okay, no, the buffalo are actually natural. What's the buffalo next to that isn't natural?
The bridge.
Yeah, there's a walkway there because they had so many people through here, they're probably getting too much erosion. And people were also complaining their feet were getting dirty. So you've got the 21st century view of nature. Now, as you can tell, this is going to go south in a hurry. What are most of these people doing? It's very 2020s. Well, I guess actually this is 8 years ago. So in this case, very 2012.
Taking photographs.
And what are they going to do with them?
Post them?
They're going to post them, yeah. Now they're going to post them. Now they'd be posting them on Snapchat or whatever. Okay. I would post it on TikTok, but TikTok's not around right now. Okay, so here we go. Now watch this. Now remember, this is designed, this park is designed with things like the bison in it. So people are coming here to experience nature. Corey, before I get any further, since I've had to deal with bison more than once, in fact, there used to be a bison ranch in Honolulu, I'm not sure if it's still there. I used to know the owner. We used to go out there and goof around with him. I grew up with bison at least part of the time. These things can go 45 to 55 miles an hour. They can jump about 15 feet before they hit ground. They've got extremely good sense of smell and extremely good hearing and very poor eyesight. Bison can basically see about 6 feet in front of them. Anything beyond that's a total blur. They're predated upon by bears and wolves. So on one hand, they're very powerful. Their front hooves can punch right through the side of a car if they decide to kick it hard enough. So they're incredibly fast. They're incredibly powerful. This is all muscle. The whole thing is built to run. A bison can basically cover about probably 35 to 45 miles a day without any trouble. They're not even going to be wheezing hard at the end of it. So these things were designed for huge open prairie spaces, but they're not, they can't see the world around them very well. Think of walking through life in a total blur. And they can smell. But of course, in this situation, what's going to be a problem with what the bison smells versus what a bison would normally smell if it's just like hanging around here in the woods? And remember, he can't see. So since these folks are now in smelling range, since bison can smell about probably almost a quarter mile, what's the problem he's having?
There's different smells coming through.
Yeah. I mean, you think if you have a dog or a cat or something else, he didn't. I mean, I assume these kids probably have deodorant. They've been eating stuff. There's all sorts of smells. Their smell is super sensitive, much better than a dog's. So he smells all sorts of stuff, none of which make any sense to him. So as far as he's concerned, all this weird shit just suddenly showed up when he was out just, hanging around doing his thing. That includes these folks over here. And so he's not particularly happy, but he can't see it. Now, if you're large, but you're prone to being eaten, you're going to do one of two things. Either you're going to run away, or if you're really big, as bison are, you tend to get really aggro really fast, because most things, even like a bear or a pack of wolves, if you charge them, they'll disappear because they don't want to get into a fight. They just want lunch. So as you can see, this is going to go somewhere pretty fast. Now, what can you tell me about these folks already? And let me give you a hint. When you work for the National Park Service, they tell you no one gets within 300 feet of a bison. And that's only if you're downwind. You never get 300 feet upwind of a bison, because then the smell's going to go down. They're going to smell you. So you always want to make sure that you're where they can't smell you. You want to make sure you're far enough away they can't see you. They can still hear you, but they're not probably going to do anything. Okay. Now, what can you tell me that I can almost guarantee these folks do not know? Because they're classic tourists. And that's where we spend 90% of our time at Yellowstone rescuing tourists from either bison or especially bears. What don't they know about this thing?
How aggressive they could get.
Yeah, I'd say they don't know anything about that thing. If anything, they maybe saw some sort of vague semi-Disney movie or something. They have no idea what they're looking at. They have no idea what it is. Their view of this might be equivalent to a little cute stuffed animal they bought in the Yellowstone, gift shop or something like that. So they have no idea what they're dealing with, and then they're totally clueless. You can see him rocking. He's rocking because he's stressing out. Now, when they shake their head, it's time to get out of town. That's a threat move. It's like a dog growling. He's actually being really good. He's trying hard not to attack.
He's gesturing.
You have to remember, from his standpoint, what's happening if you can't see at all, if you're almost blind, but you can see about 6 feet. What's he thinking right now as these people pass through here? What's he seeing in his eyes? He's seeing blurry shapes go by. They all smell really weird. They sound really weird. Everything about them is really weird, and now they're really close to him and they're moving, which if you tend to be paranoid, and bison are, he's somewhere way beyond freaked out. That's a classic episode. I can guarantee you could film those probably every day of the week, every day the park's open. The sad thing about it is if this bison's caught in a situation where he does that twice, we'd have to take him down. You kill him. It's considered the bison's fault that he reacted to the people. Bears get one chance. If a bear is seen and someone's stupid enough to feed him a candy or something like that, which people love to do because they think bears are cute, and the bear attacks or chases them, they tag the bear. The second time the bear's in the trap and move him away. The second time the bear's caught doing anything, you shoot him. So the end result of that, these people won't know that, but there's a good chance that bison was dead by the next day. For no other purpose than being in a place where bison are at so people can experience them. This is the American ambivalence about nature. People want to have something to do with nature, but they want it on their terms. They want a domesticated version. They want this to be sort of like a cute puppy or something like that. They don't want the actual nature. Now, one of the other things they don't want is they don't want nature that includes the complexity of nature. So even in the national park, they have wolves. But that's been a huge fight since the 1980s to allow wolves back into Yellowstone and to not control them. And as of 3 years ago, they started shooting the wolves. Now, traditionally, wolves were a major part of your upper tier predators that actually kept the ecological balance in the park. There were too many deer, there were too many rabbits and stuff like that. So the coyotes and the wolves are there and they control those populations. But for the tourist, the view of the coyotes and the wolves is they very frequently see them make a kill of a cute little bunny in the middle of an area and then tear it apart. And the general protest from folks like this, I'm not picking on them individually, was that was a horrible thing for their kids to see an animal kill another animal and kill it and eat it right in front of them. So what you had was, on one hand, the American perception of nature that is something you're supposed to value and enjoy. But on the other hand, these folks are so clueless about what nature is that they put their own set of stereotypes or perception of what nature is on it. And then sadly enough, if you're the animals here, or the National Park Service, you have to manage to those perceptions, not manage to the reality of the place. Okay. So this is one of the complexities of the way that Americans see the world around them. Now, even more sort of bizarre of all this, so this is the national park. And so in here, you've got your bison, your bear, and all your other stuff. If one of those bison or bear wanders across here, especially if it's a bear and wanders across this purple boundary, which of course doesn't exist, there's no fence. But if it happens to wander over here during 4 months of the year, it can be shot on sight. Because outside of here, that's not national park and that's free hunting for 4 months of the year. So the bear in here can exhibit one set of behaviors. The bear over here is a target for roughly a third of the year. So what you get is, again, the idea of managed property, but there's no boundaries, and so the animals and stuff move back and forth. In here, coyotes, there's some hunting of them, but that's generally, in a very calculated way. Out here in Wyoming, unless it's changed in the last year or two, you get $50 a tail. So every time you kill a coyote, you cut the tail off, you take it, and the state pays you $50. So those guys, and I know because some of my relatives used to do this, there are guys that do nothing but make their entire living off of killing coyotes. They don't eat the animal. They don't do anything with it. They just cut it, kill it, leave it in the ground, cut the tail off, take it, and get $50. So, if you're any good in a couple hours, you can make a couple $100 killing coyotes. And you just have, 8 or 10 carcasses just lying on the road. And that's the way you do it, because that's the idea of managing this, because coyotes are seen as an unwanted predator. So what you get is a very, very strange situation of the American perception of a landscape and the American perception of nature that really has very little to do with, if you were a biologist or a botanist or a zoologist looking at this, none of this would make any sense in terms of the way these are handled, the idea of a boundary area. But it's very much an American attitude of the idea that nature, and on one hand, exists, and you're supposed to like it the way it is. On the other hand, you're supposed to manage and control and domesticate it. That's part of this very, very complex, sort of paradox that we have. Now, the other part of that would be this. In this same area. Now, wait. I almost forget, I got to set these things up. This is one of the other perceptions of nature. As far as perception of nature was the idea of the log cabin, on the sort of quintessential Western, landscape piece of residence. What you've got is this idea of something that's actually built from the trees around it and sort of embedded in nature. Now, what you find is in the 19th century, midnight up to the mid-19th century, this is what it was. And when people lived in log cabins, it was basically a statement of their lack of resources. So big things made of the fact that Abraham Lincoln was born in a log cabin. So what that meant is his family had settled in an area that of course, used to have a few Indians, but don't worry about those. But they had cut and cleared that area, and with the resources, i.e. the trees they'd cut, to make the house they live in. Now, that was the early mid-19th century. This is what it manifests into in the 20th, 21st century. Now, what's this place? I mean, it's a house, believe it or not. What's this place saying? Is that something that Peyton went and with a few of his friends went and took a couple of chainsaws and whacked that sucker out in a couple of days from the trees around them and built that house? I mean, I know you're probably good with a chainsaw, but I sort of, or is this something else? Weird thing is you'd find the vast majority of people that have a house like this are a couple. So it's a good bet there's probably 2 adults and maybe 1 or 2 kids to live in this house. And I can almost guarantee it's only part-time. Are these people still in nature? Okay, so a couple of people shaking their head, but there's trees. There's a tree right here. There's a tree right here. There's a baby tree there, and there's some trees back here. Huh? I didn't catch that.
It's not the same. It looks like more like, I guess, like a suburban type of area. Like, yeah, there's like a forest in the background, but it's not the same as if there was like a little cabin like the first image that you showed us.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. Now, notice how what's interesting though, if you think of like the regular suburban town, what can you tell me about this area right here in front? What's missing there if that would be a suburban house?
Grass.
Yeah, there's no lawn. So this implies you're in the wilderness because you don't have to have a lawn. Okay. And so this becomes part of the sort of weird juxtaposition. There's another one's even better. This one's even more subtle. This one's actually got a lawn. Okay. So when you're building this, on one hand, you're building this because it has connotations of nature. But, this isn't a log cabin that a family knocked up in a couple of weeks in the middle of the wilderness. Oh, this is an entirely different type of phenomena. This is a huge industry in the United States, building massive log cabins. There's whole parts of the United States that have tons of these things in actually massive quantities. And they all serve sort of the same function. They're intentionally designed to be embedded, if you would, into what's seen as a natural setting, which is one reason why you use this type of construction versus, regular suburban construction, which you equally well could do. So this type of construction is seen as more appropriate in the American context, with the idea of being in a quote natural setting unquote. So that's one of those weird paradoxes again. This idea of domestication. You've taken nature here with the idea of one person or one family's effort, and you've turned into these massive statements of of economic success. many of them architecturally done. There's still a huge business in making actual prefab log cabins. You actually buy these as kits and you stick them and put them together. Well, you hire someone to put them together. But notice how with all these images, you can go through the whole Google thing here. Notice how invariably you're wrapped around with trees. So the implication is always that these are put in nature. Now, what would be seen as the attractive advantage of this house versus a regular suburban house? Why would Alyssa live in, if Alyssa's living here instead of a suburban house, why did she choose this place if she's sort of stereotypically American? What does this house give her that's different? For example, what's she going to hear at night? Theoretically, will she hear her neighbors and cars driving by and stuff like that? No. If she hears anything, what's it going to be?
Crickets and nature stuff.
Yeah, nature stuff. You know, wind blowing through trees, you know, an owl hooting or something like that. You're supposed to be, this is an area, this is very much part of the American ethos, this idea of being with nature. That was why the enormous pressure in the 70s and 80s to allow people to build into the national forest, because areas around the national forest had been urbanized. They'd been turned into suburbs and places like that. They weren't quote natural anymore. So it was a huge pressure from realtors and builders in the construction industry to allow people to build places like this in what had been protected forest land for the purpose of allowing people with enough money. This wasn't for folks, you know, on the dole, for people with enough money to live in nature. But then, of course, comes the paradox. There's sort of two paradoxes of this. One is this isn't very natural, per se. And secondly, of course, is what happens if there's a fire? How fireproof is this place? Sort of like, it's way beyond not, okay? I mean, the whole thing's made of wood. In fact, very frequently, these things, you love to use cedar shingles, which I've never figured out. That's, for some reason, it's not illegal in the national forest areas to not have a cedar roof, which if you think about it, cedar is very prone to catching fire. So if you build a roof of cedar shingles on one of these, I think there's one right here. Yeah. So if you build a cedar roof on this thing and this hillside back here catches fire, any ember coming down lining this thing, 10 seconds later, pop, it's gone. Okay. But because that's part of the ethos, this should be built with natural materials. It means the whole thing's basically, you know, it's like having a wad of paper next to a barbecue. You're just asking for trouble. And yet this is part of the logic that Americans have of nature, because if the person's buying this place, well, this is really domesticated. But if the person's buying this place and they have this cedar roof and someone's actually told them, hey, you know, you got to be a little careful. This doesn't make a lot of sense. You've got this area here that could catch fire sometime. What's their answer going to be? Yeah, I mean, yeah, pretty much exactly. It's going to be, oh, that's what the Forest Service is for. That's why we've got firefighters. They're supposed to make sure my house doesn't catch fire. Never mind the fact that 40 years ago, you wouldn't have been allowed to build here. And the reason they wouldn't let them build is because they said, if you built a national forest, we can't guarantee you won't catch fire, because that's what forests do. Forests burn down. So weird thing about many of these places, and that's including a lot of places that have gone up in smoke in the last couple of days, is what type of insurance can't these folks get? One type of insurance they can't get. If this whole hillside catches fire and this house burns down and I own it, what can't I call my insurance company and tell them I want?
Wildfire insurance.
Yeah, I can't get fire insurance. I can get fire insurance if a fire starts inside the house, but I cannot get fire insurance for anything that happens outside. So if that fire happens and my house burns down, I'm totally liable for it. If this house costs $400,000, I'm out $400,000. The insurance company will not pay a penny. Now, if it's also near a river and it floods, they'll tell me exactly the same thing. You're in a national forest zone. The rivers there are not controlled, so therefore, if they flood, tough shit. So when you build in these places, there's a weird, you'd think that one of the side effects would be you'd be very leery about building a place like this since you can't get fire insurance, you can't get flood insurance, but you might have both those things around you. But in a weird way, if I have a lot of money, why am I going to build it here anyways? And remember, one of the things about the Americans is Americans are very into conspicuous consumption. What's one of the like uber or ultimate versions of conspicuous consumption, especially if this is an $8 million house? And I can't get insurance for it. What am I telling everyone if my house burns down? What am I going to do? I'm just going to walk, go live in a van. I'll give you a hint. It has to do with this. The 8.2 mil. If it burns down, the insurance company isn't going to pay me a penny. So therefore, how much money do I actually have in the bank?
You have a lot.
Yeah, I have a lot. The 8.2 million is sort of a bummer, but I'll turn around, I'll rebuild. You see this a lot if you remember the fires in California, because a good friend of mine used to live in one of those neighborhoods back in Southern California near LA that goes up Laurel Canyon or something like that. It goes up in fire every year. And he lost 2 homes up there. And in both cases, he didn't have any fire insurance. You couldn't get fire insurance there because the insurance company said, you got to be nuts to build up there. It catches fire all the time. And everyone that built up there, the minute the smoke would clear and it would cool down, you'd see tractors up there and they'd be putting in a brand new house where their other house had been. Now, from a totally rational, practical perspective or functional perspective, what's really nuts about that? Especially if I'm the one that put in the one house that burned down and now I'm going to build another house right on the concrete pad of the first house that just finished cooling. What's totally doesn't make any sense about that? What's going to happen within probably another 10 years?
It's gonna burn down.
Yeah, the next one's going to burn down. So like Peyton was saying earlier, notice how much money I've got to have. I've got to have enough money not to build a house. I've got to have enough money to build house after house after house in the same place. And I asked him once, I said, he'd lost 2 homes. I said, dude, what the hell are you doing? Well, he's one of the top screenwriters in Hollywood. He made tons of money and he really liked it there and had a great view. And I'm thinking, then just drive up there and look at it in a car, for Christ's sakes, but to sit there and lose $2 million every shot. And of course, everything you've got in the house disappears too. So you've got to replace everything. And on top of that, usually if the houses go up, whatever the district or county or whatever it is, then also the homeowners have to pay a fire fee to keep the fire company going so they can go up there next time and hopefully save your house the next time it happens. So there's all these enormous expenses. So basically, it's sort of like a house made out of paper. You build a disposable house. And when people drive by, and if they know that, notice what you're telling them. You're not telling them that I have an $8 million house. I have so much money that an $8 million house, I can lose it and it doesn't bother me. I can replace it. So it'd be sort of like if you have a car, it'll say you buy a Mercedes, and after 6 months, you just don't, you're bored with it. So you just sit there and you just, since you're not using Olive Wana for anything right now, you just park at Olive Wana Center and throw a torch in and just watch it blow up. And immediately march down to the Mercedes dealership and say, I want another one. Because I know your insurance company's going to pay it for you. You blew your own car up. But it's saying, I have so much money, I don't care. Cars and stuff are disposable. So notice how one of the weird side effects of nature is if you build in this type of nature in the United States, there's sort of a weird assumption that on one hand, you're going to build in something that sort of is of nature. I mean, notice that's rather sad. Notice the size of the trees that were cut down to make these pillars. These are huge trees that were cut down for the purpose of making an enormous, grandiose super house. But if it's in one of these areas, then it's very likely sooner or later, within probably 20 years, that house is going to be a pile of cinders. You have to do the whole thing all over again. So a lot of this stuff is a fascination with the environment, with nature, but it's not by any stretch of the imagination environmental. And it's a weird sort of contradiction in American society about this idea of environment and environmental. See, it's classically with this. Let's see if I can set this up. called clear cutting. Let me see if I can pull up the image here. Okay, when I do that, do you guys see this image? Do you see the, okay. This is clear cutting. I used to live in Eugene, Oregon for a little while. This is a fascinating example of a whole mess of this sort of environmental logic. Because if you remember, I mentioned that starting in the 1980s, especially pressure from, construction industry, realtors and such like that, pushed homes into national forest because there was so much money to be made out of it, and otherwise you're not using the land. Notice how, again, you end up with the same repartee as that weird lady floating over the landscape back in the 19th century, that the landscape's empty unless you're going to make something out of it. And you're wasting the resources if you're not making something out of it. This is probably the most striking. You go anywhere in the Pacific West, from Colorado west, especially in the Northwest, and you see this. This is how you cut trees down. This is called clear cutting. Now I should point out, this is after the trees have been harvested. So what you do is you go in and you basically just cut the crap out of everything here that's of a certain size. You cut down the parts that you want, and you leave all the rest of it. So you don't clean this up, you just leave it here. The initial argument is by leaving this stuff here, this will make sure that the soil won't wash away, which it doesn't do that actually. But then what you can come in is about 3 to 5 years later, after you've lost through erosion most of the stuff, when you come in and plant baby trees. They call this reforestation. Now, here's a reforested area. What can you tell me that's sort of odd about these trees? It might be sort of a trick question unless you've actually seen a regular forest.
They look kind of skinny.
Okay, they're real skinny. There's way too many of them. What else? It's probably the most eerie aspect about it, but in most cases, I don't think people actually notice it. I'll give you a hint. It has to do with the height. And think of Mother Nature. What do you see here that you shouldn't see? See if anyone notices. We'll just ask, we'll say this tree's 50 feet tall. How tall is this tree? Maybe 55. How tall is that tree? 45, 50. How tall that tree? 55, 45, 50, 55, 45, 55. What's weird about this if it was a natural forest? What doesn't Mother Nature do that you see here?
It doesn't like standardize or like create the same thing.
Yeah, this is a planted forest. This isn't natural at all. This area was clear cut and it was planted probably about 15 years earlier, 20 years earlier, with new hybridized types of pines, which grow faster. Because this particular area, they don't turn these trees into construction. This particular area, they turn most of this into pulp. Okay. So this makes up cardboard. They're going to make cardboard out of these trees. So they don't particularly care if the trees are very hard. They don't care if the trees are particularly big. They just want them to be trees. So they basically turn into trees into sort of like a type of grass. You just want to grow really, really fast to get as much altitude as possible so you can harvest them again. So if you come back, in another 5 years, they will have just planted this area in baby trees. And all the baby trees, of course, are going to be the same size because they're all planted at one point in time. In fact, if you decide you want to quit university, one of the jobs you can get is tree planters. Boise, Cascade, Warehouse, the other big firms are always hiring people to plant trees in the summer and spring and fall. And then they're going to harvest this section. So 5 years from now, this area will have little baby trees, like little miniature Christmas trees. And this area will all look like this. And then 5 years later, these will be slightly grown up. These will be baby trees. 15 years later, this will look like that. That'll be baby trees. See, this is basically a tree farm. It's considered, this is actually part of a national forest. So this is part of theoretically lands that were being saved or preserved for people to use. But the demand to make money out of a wasted resources was so great that most of it's been logged. And it's been, basically whacked in this particular form. Let's see if we can find it. It's a good example here. This is what it usually likes when they've first done it. Here you see the result of it. Here you've got a just clear-cut section just been done. Notice how when you look at these things, it looks like it's been mowed with a weed whacker. Everything's exactly the same height within that section. You can see the different areas when they were planted. This was planted not too long ago. This has been there for a little longer. So the weird thing is what you don't have is two things. One is you don't have variety in size. You don't have big old trees and little trees and trees in between. You also don't have any trees on the ground because they're all the same age. Now, what you also don't have in this is you don't have mixed trees. All you have is the one species that was planted here. So your biodiversity is completely gone. If you've got, for example, woodpeckers that actually maybe eat the seeds or the pine nuts out of these particular pine trees, but they live in ash trees, then you're not going to find any woodpeckers here because there's no ash trees left. They were all cut down when they cleared this area out. In fact, since you can't make any money out of ash or the other trees, those are the ones that you cut down and just leave the logs lying here. So what you do is you trim this whole area down. You basically mow it like a lawn, and then you replant it with one species that you can make money out of.
Wouldn't
Now,
this also, oh sorry, wouldn't this also be like an example of deforestation in a way?
sort of. It's a little more subtle than deforestation. In fact, Boise Cascade Warehouse are the big companies that do all this. They would argue that it's not deforestation because they're replanting trees in it. But notice how that's what I'd call lawyer speak. Why?
Gotcha. Thank you. I just wanted to ask.
Yeah, because you don't have, now see, the only spot that you have it here, notice how there's different sizes? That's because it's so steep that they couldn't forest it. So what you've got is a little pocket of biodiversity here. But for most of the planets and animals that live up here, everything they would normally eat and everything is gone because all they've got here, for all intents and purposes, might as well be made out of plastic as far as they're concerned. It doesn't have the resources they're going to use. So when you go through these areas, what's really creepy is you very rarely hear birds. You're in the middle of a forest, you could walk for days through this stuff and you won't hear anything. You won't see very many animals. You aren't going to see any deer in here because guess what? There's nothing the deer eat. They literally starve to death in the middle of a forest. Okay. So yeah, you're right. It's a creepy version of deforestation. In some ways you could argue deforestation is more honest because nothing but empty blank land. This looks like it's forested. It is forested. But for the mother nature that lives in this area, it's to all intents and purposes almost useless. As a side effect, why is this area going to really be prone to catching fire? A lot of your fires occur in these clear-cut areas. And I'll give you a hint. These particular types of pines, because they're fast-growing pines, also are very soft. So the wood's very soft. If there's a windstorm, these things will fall all over the place, make a huge mess. In fact, it looks like there's a big fall. They call it a fall. It's like there's been a fall over here somewhere. If this place catches fire, what's going to be the huge problem if Josiah is a firefighter? In fact, there's sort of two problems. One minor one, which is sort of scary because a guy I knew he was a firefighter for the feds, is it was real easy if you were a firefighter to get lost in this stuff. Why? What's the huge problem if you're fighting a fire right here? If you look around the trees around you, what don't you see? There's no differences. There's no large trees. There's nothing to sight on. There's nothing to give you an orientation or direction. If you're in the trees and you can't see the sky, you have no idea. All you've got is maybe a compass. So it's really easy to get caught in these things and trapped when a fire goes by. Secondly, because these things are very weak, it means they're also prone to catching fire. So if a fire starts in one of these managed forests, they call them managed forests usually, they move really fast. So if you get a wind blowing, you could go through this, fire could start here, a good wind's blowing like they got right now in California. You could be on the other side of this ridge in probably 6 hours. It can move a lot faster than you can walk. And if you're stuck in here, you can't see where you're going particularly. You can't see what's around you. And because all of this dead fall's still under here, So on one hand, you've got these trees planted here, but underneath that, if you're trying to walk on the ground, you've got all the old logs and all the old pieces of cut trees and everything that was around here. It's incredibly difficult to walk through here. This is why when you go through here, you pretty much have to use the old, what they call logging roads to get around, because you literally cannot cross this stuff. If you know, if Josiah or someone else is trying to walk from here over to here, that would probably take you about 45 minutes to an hour. And that's probably the distance from, say, you know, the lower end of campus to the, that's not even to the mall. I mean, to the little, you know, Kaimuki Mall, the little blue building. This would be shorter than to Times by quite a distance. In fact, it's pretty much, this is not much larger than campus, but it's almost impenetrable. So all the stuff under here has this as the undergrowth, or I should say the underlayer. So it's pretty much what you've done is you've managed this forest into something that you can make money off of, but it's not really a viable biotic system anymore. It's something that looks like trees, acts and sounds like trees, but it doesn't have the resources that you'd have in trees. So this has been one of the huge problems in the American West is you've got literally millions and millions of acres. And because this was all national forest land, when they forested and harvested it, they paid almost nothing for the property, because the argument that the companies had is, well, we're taking trees out and we're putting trees back. So therefore that's a net zero for the American public. So therefore we shouldn't have to put any more money into it than planting the trees, because, you know, all this trees grow, trees get cut, another tree grows. So we're not really taking anything permanently. It's just sort of like we're temporarily borrowing the trees from the landscape because we're going to put them back. So this is one of the huge complexities when you're looking at these type of things, is things like, you know, clear cutting and the side effects of all those.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, you know how we're the world is like short on the amount of trees that it needs to sustain life.
Yeah.
Basically, there's like a lot of like nonprofits or whatever who are trying to gather money to plant more trees.
Yeah.
So is that even like a viable way to restore like the tree population if the trees aren't going to be the same?
My point would be, as a geographer, single species planting is a waste of time. Because in single species, you're not replacing a forest. You're replacing a species, which is basically, as far as I'm concerned, like a grass lawn. So if you're planting, you know, if you're replanting ohia, for example, here in Hawaii, but you're not planting milo or anything else around it, then you're not going to have a viable forest, because, you know, where the ohia exist, where, for example, I do my work in East Maui, that's part of a very complex system with maybe 30 or 40 different types of plants all in close proximity. You could plant all 30 or 40, but in fact, we have a project, the project over there that they're running off of the little side whatever, the botanical park. They actually are doing that, but it's very, very difficult to plant 5 or 10 or 15 different species of plants. They were doing ohia planting, and they realized very quickly it wasn't working. In fact, the interesting thing is, at least with Hawaiian plants, if you try to plant a single species, it generally doesn't work very well, because Hawaiian plants tend to be very symbiotic. And ohia, for example, wants about 3 or 4 different species of plants around the base, and it actually interacts with them in a very complex chemical way. So if you just plant the one, it's sort of like wondering where everyone else went. And I would say you're exactly right. And most of the world, no, it's not a viable idea. Yeah, you're getting tree replacement. So this is generating more oxygen than, for example, this does. And it's taking in more carbon dioxide. But you're not putting this back. You're putting a very artificial construct, which, when you think of this amount of area, if you look at all this area, has been all mowed except this one little bump here. You think the amount of literally thousands of acres you've got just in this one image, of which one little tiny spot is your only biodiverse area. Even if you quit clear cutting, if you quit foresting this section, it's going to be so difficult for the other species to come back in, because now you've got a mature, you know, permanent forest, and the ground is now covered in shade. It's going to be very hard for anything else to come back in and resettle itself in this monoculture environment. And that's generally what we call these. We call these monoculture systems. And if you know anything about the way that nature operates, nature doesn't work in monocultures. So what you do is, but this allows you to argue, we're managing the forest. We're managing the American forest lands for the good of the American public. Never mind the fact that a few companies are making all the money out of it. But they can go back and say, see, look how nice and green it is. And you know, they're right. But green doesn't mean good. Green just means green. It's better than this. But then of course they did that too. So yeah, it's part of a very, very complicated situation where talking about preservation of resources and even things like environmental preservation or environmental restoration are very, very complicated. I think it's University of Iowa has been trying to, let's see if we can find this here. The University of Iowa has been trying for I don't know how many years to basically restore prairie lands in Iowa. They've had an enormous amount of pushback from all sorts of folks, some of which make absolutely no sense to me. Okay, let's stop that. I want to pull this up. Let's see. Yeah, okay, here we go. Okay, this is a typical prairie landscape, or I should say a modern prairie landscape. Now, if you remember that forest where we had the one species, what's the difference between that image and this image? I mean, not just like in the foreground, I mean this whole image. How many species of things do you see there?
More than one.
Yeah, at least I'd say at least 6 or 10. You've got different types of grasses, you've got different types of shrubs and trees. It's a very mixed landscape. This is the landscape they've been trying to restore. I still can't find it. I'm pretty sure it's University of Iowa. There's been an enormous amount of pushback that this is not viable and you shouldn't be doing it and all sorts of stuff. Where's that Canada one? In Canada, they've had national policy for the last 80 years is to actually keep a chunk of the prairies. I can't remember if it's Alberta or Saskatchewan, one of the central provinces actually has, I believe, about 300,000 acres in prairie. So you're not allowed to farm it, you're not allowed to do anything. It's part of their version of a national park. I'm going to use University of Iowa because I can't remember. They were trying to argue that you should have this as a national park. Why was it shot down? Even the state legislature wouldn't allow it. They couldn't make it a state park, no national park, no nada. What about the American attitude of nature? Does this not fit? And again, think of our log house. What's the American attitude of nature? What does it have to have this picture's missing?
Something that's like entertaining or that catches the eye.
Yeah, I'm thinking trees is a perfect case in point. Remember that bison chasing that kid around? Gotta have trees. Not by accident, by the early 20th century, that the bison were extinct in the United States. At the same time, they had thirds of over 50,000 in Canada. The only reason there's bison in Yellowstone is because they actually caught and moved bison down from Canada back to the United States. So it says something about the fact you could so hugely modify it. This is what all the Midwest looked like. All the Midwest was in this prairie. Now it's all in farms. Okay, because this is seen as a useless environment because no one's making money out of it. Like Peyton was saying, it's not particularly, quote, attractive to the American ethos of what nature should look like. It's totally natural. This is actually what a large chunk of North America looked like prior to people messing around with it. But it doesn't fit the stereotype of it. Because it doesn't fit that stereotype, it means that you don't want to manage it, you don't want to spend the time and effort trying to make it happen, and you don't want to turn it back to that. And one of the reasons that Iowa, I'm just going to, again, I apologize, I can't remember who exactly did it, is they pointed out that it doesn't look like it because you don't see a lot of variety on the surface, but there's actually about 15 or 20 different varieties of plants in here. And it's got a huge amount of zoological variety. There's a tremendous number of animals and stuff that run around in here and use this, most of which is missing the minute that you turn this into farmland. So just like the managed forest is different than a quote natural forest, what you find is this is totally different from a, say, a farm in Illinois or something like that. They're entirely different type of system. This doesn't visibly look different because it doesn't look like anything interesting. It's not worth saving from an environmental perspective if you're American. If you're Canadian, yeah, but not if you're from the United States. This is not a suitable park. People would ask, why isn't this open for development? Why can't I do something with it? What are you saving here? I don't see anything. Okay. Now, part of this is what we also call, this is probably the classic one because I actually started when I was looking at it. Let's see where I can put it here. Oops. Okay. Back, where'd it go? Oh, here it is. Oh, shoot. So I wanted Black Rock Desert. Sorry, I got the wrong thing here. So I get for clicking before I'm watching where it's refilled this. This is quintessentially one of the, what we call, at least in the studies that I'm involved in, or we call these empty places. Empty places are a perception that especially Americans have of parts of the United States that serve no function. They're not attractive, they're not useful, they're not this, that, or the other thing. And because they're not, they serve no function, and they don't even serve visual attractive function, you can do whatever you want to with them. It's not by accident that most of the nuclear testing was done in deserts. Not by accident that a huge part of Nevada is part of the Department of Defense. If you're going to fly a new plane that might blow up or anything else that might blow up, you do it in Nevada because no one gives a crap what you do in a desert. It's just not, no one cares. Okay. This place is also famous for something else. Anyone know? Actually, when I was first mentioned, when I first started talking about what I was going to talk about today.
Area 51.
Nope, but that's a good example. No, you're exactly right in the sense that it's very similar. Area 51, again, is in a desert. And if given what the mystery is, you could stick a secret facility to stash aliens out there because no one would know because it's a desert, so whoever gives a shit. It's the middle of nowhere. This is further north. This is northeast of Reno. And something happens there this time of year that's not going to happen this year. This is an example of it. This is right in the middle of that desert. It goes on, I think, for about a week. I can never remember how long it goes on. Let's see the title here. This is where they do that Burning Man thing. And the reason they do it here is because there's nothing there. So for a whole week, you can basically 80,000 people paying between $455 to $1,400 for 3 days, go and run around in the desert to experience whatever you're going to experience there in terms of art or whatever. Go and take a look go to YouTube and look at the Burning Man videos. If you want to see it, it's incredibly strange. It's so very quintessentially American. It's sort of mind-blowing. And one of the side effects of this is one of the things you have to do is they invariably destroy everything that's made there. They have these huge fires and you burn down everything that you build. So whatever they put in here, like that, at the end of the 3 or 4 day period or whatever it is, you destroy this. You intentionally burn it down. And you build the whole thing again, just like a blank chalkboard or something like, a blank whiteboard. Then you do the whole thing over again the next year. Now, why does that make sense from an American point of view? I mean, the art's really cool. They do some seriously trippy stuff out there. This is a good example. But what's the odd aspect of that? In fact, why do they do it there in that desert? In fact, you can see the desert right there. Why is this considered to be the quintessential art thing of the 21st century? And last year they canceled this year's obviously, but last year they had something like 300,000 people. They're limited to 80,000 persons. This is on national parkland. This is part of the national forest. So it's under control of Bureau of Land Management, BLM. And they limit this to 80,000 people, and they had over 300,000 people that applied to go to it. But only 80,000 people are let in. So you're there, this happens in June. So the average temperature would be, I used to work down south of here a little bit. Average temperature would be 103 to 110 during the middle of the day here. Why would Montserrat let herself hang around a place like this for 3 days in average temperatures over 100 degrees to experience all this stuff? What's the fascination that Americans have with this? What can you guarantee after day 5 if you come a day late? What are you going to see here? The day after Burning Man is done, what's going to be left?
Nothing.
Nothing. Nothing. Actually, part of the contract they have is they burn everything, then they actually take it and they all ship it out. So you import everything in for 3 or 4 days. They build it, and then people see it for 3 or 4 days. Then it's all gone, and the next year you start all over again. So you're never going to see one year. You're never going to see the stuff that you see the next year. So it's all going to be temporary. It all lasts less than a week. So what does this say about the American relationship with nature? I mean, this is totally natural. It's a desert. What do you do with that nature? It sort of goes back to the Area 51 comment. Let me rephrase it. What relationship does this object have with the desert around it? Let's go look at another one. Well, this must have been the center headquarters because it has the Burning Man logo on it. What relationship do these things have with the place that they've been put? Especially given the fact that
any relationship?
None. Yeah, none.
Yeah.
The only relationship they have is this is a totally useless piece of property by the American view of land, the American view of place. This is a totally non-existent place, so therefore it's the perfect place to do whatever you want to because no one gives a shit and no one's going to care. As long as you pick up after yourself, you can come back and do something totally different the next year. So this is a totally non-existent environment for all intents and purposes. This was actually part of the Northern Shoshone region. So it's actually part of a Native American group, actually has a large reservation nearby. And they're really unhappy about all this. But the attitude is, well, it's outside of your boundaries. So therefore, why would we care what you think? Because their relationship with land is very, very, very different. Now, sort of final point, if you want to make about this, when you're thinking about going back to the stuff I've been looking at environmentally, this also ties in the whole thing when you think about it, about the discussions we have here about reef or near ocean resources. You know, if you have a reef, and Hanauma Bay is a perfect case in point. Do you preserve Hanauma Bay? Which means basically have very few people. There's an interesting study that DLNR just did a couple of weeks ago, which pointed out that Hanauma Bay has now recovered almost half its biodiversity just because there aren't any tourists there. So do you want to preserve the bay as a biodiverse environment? But then of course, then you don't allow tourists there, which means that people aren't going to make a lot of money. So, you know, when tourism starts back up, there's going to be a lot of tour companies that get really pissed off and say, you're going to ruin our income because tourists have to go out there because it's one of the things they want to see. And that's why they come to Oahu. So if they're there, you're not going to have the biodiversity, but you're going to be making money out of it. Then of course, around the edges of it and sometimes sneaking into it, you've got the guys that collect all the fish who make money off of harvesting little fish and then selling them to aquariums. So you've got two different groups that are basically for different reasons want to make money off of a piece of the environment that they're saying, well, if you're not allowing people to make money, you're wasting the resource. On the other hand, you've got the biodiversity argument. And this is typical of a lot of these discussions, going back to what I think Peyton or someone else said earlier, and that's, or maybe it was Emily, which is the fact that it's very hard to figure out. It's not really so much that there's right and wrongs. It's just that with a limited amount of places, there's always something else you can do at that place. Whether it's the best choice depends on your point of view of what it is that places should serve. And so this whole issue, I mean, all of this is geography. You could do someone ought to do their dissertation on Burning Man, not so much what they do there, but why they do it there. And you could do a whole nother dissertation on Area 51. You know, there's a whole tourist industry based around people driving around there hoping to see aliens down there outside of Vegas at Area 51. So there's this weird perception of the place that people have in their heads, despite they've never experienced it. So perception drives how we see everything. You know, in the United States is in some cases probably one of the weirdest examples of that. Okay, with that I sort of finished my dog and pony show. Any questions or comments? Everyone's all set? Okay, if that's it, then I guess I'll see you guys Thursday. Yep. Okay, if we're all good, then see you guys later. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.